André Citroën, wanted to build a car that was revolutionary. He had built cars up until the Traction Avant from 1919 till about 1934. They were all conventional cars like everybody else. I'm George Dyke, and this is a Citroën Traction Avant 15.6. This car is the basis of most modern automobiles today. It was introduced in 1934, and it was the first mass-produced front-wheel drive car, first mass-produced car with a monocoque body, first mass-produced car with hydraulic brakes, torsion bar suspension, rack and pinion steering. This car was revolutionary because every car in that era was based on a frame. A body was mounted on the frame, additional components like fenders were added to the body. André Citroën wanted to have a complete automobile, and he wanted to have something that was a physical statement. So he hired a sculptor from Italy by the name of Flaminia Bertoni, and he sculpted the Traction Avant. It was the first car to actually be designed in sort of a wind tunnel characteristic. When the Traction Avant was introduced, this is a monocoque body, so unlike a car that sat very high, this car sat extremely low, and with front-wheel drive it had handling capabilities like nothing else on the road in that time. In the late 1920s, he wanted to come up with a completely different automobile. He believed that the future of a car was front-wheel drive. In fact, when he was demonstrating the principle, he'd take a matchbox out and put it on a desktop, and he'd put a wooden match in the back of the matchbox and explain that if you tried to push that matchbox across a table, it wouldn't track in a very straight line. But if you moved that match to the front of the matchbox and pulled it, essentially you had complete front-wheel drive, if you will, control. In fact, he used to say that a horse pulls a carriage, doesn't push it. And that principle was adapted to the Traction Avant. The amazing thing about the Traction Avant is, unlike any car of that era, it drives like a modern car today. In fact, it drives like a freight train on rails with front-wheel drive. This car is super on the highway. It'll cruise at 120 to 130 kilometers an hour if you want. Its ability to drive over country roads, even poor ones, is phenomenal with the suspension that it has. And if you want to be able to take twisty roads, the torque and power of this car is absolutely unbelievable. The Traction was introduced at the Paris Auto Show in 1934, and it was introduced as a 4-cylinder production version. In 1938, they introduced a 6-cylinder, which is this car right here. This car behind me was built in Paris, France. In fact, it was sold to a French diplomat, and it sat in southern France for a number of years before going into a Swiss collection for about 25 years, and I acquired the car from a Swiss collector. In fact, this was introduced just before World War II, and during World War II, the Traction Avant became the preferred car for the French resistance. They could get away from the Nazis during World War II, and in fact, the Germans, when they came across the Traction Avant, would generally try to commandeer that car so they could take control of it, shoot the tires out on what they had, and drive off in a faster, more capable way in a car like the Traction. Of course, the Traction Avant's been featured in many movies, not just French gangster movies. For example, in The Sound of Music, when the Von Trapp family get away from the Germans and drive out of the convent, they're driving in a Traction. Although over 750,000 Tractions were made, a small percentage were made with a 6-cylinder engine. Traction Avants are actually fairly common even today. They've survived very well because they're built so well. They're notorious for being able to go through almost any environment and survive. There's a group called Track Bar which ship their cars around the world every few years and go on rallies. If you're interested in Traction Avants and Citroëns in general, one great resource is Citroën.ca. We're a club, and we help people keep their Citroëns on the road and also find cars that are in good condition that let you really enjoy the benefits of Citroën motoring. You can find more information at Citroën.ca. So André Citroën, he bet the company on this car. In fact, the development of the Traction Avant actually put the Citroën company into bankruptcy. When the Traction Avant was in production, in 18 months, they were returning to profitability because of the virtues of this car. So this car was produced from 1934 to 1957. In the latter years, from 1954 and a half to 1956, they built a model called the 15.6H, which had the hydraulic back-end suspension that became standard in the Citroën DS. And it's very evident that this car is the lineage of the DS and actually every major Citroën subsequent to that. What I love about it is it lets me get into the mind of what André Citroën thought what an automobile should be. And it also lets me understand how Flaminio Bertoni envisioned this car. Just when you wash it, you can actually run your hands over this body and look at subtle little changes that are made, little ridges, little creases that are put into the body that are just unbelievably clever in its design.